and answer them aloud so they'll be captured on the recording. For those of you in the Zoom room, please include your affiliation when you type your question. And please also include, if you can, who your question is for. You can also upvote questions. We're also live streaming to YouTube and Facebook. Please note, for those of you who are watching that way, you won't be able to ask questions. And just a quick reminder that all materials presented here in the briefing are not embargoed, and journalists in attendance should have received a copy of the press release in your inbox from me a few minutes ago. And with that, we'll go on to the first speaker. So next slide. We're first going to hear a welcome from the IAU by Debra Elmegreen from Vassar College. Debra is the president of the IAU.
Thank you, Amanda.
Please turn on your camera and video if you haven't already.
I did.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, do you see me?
I think it's okay to go ahead.
Thank you. The International Astronomical Union is the worldwide organization of professional astronomers. The IAU's mission is to promote and safeguard astronomy in all its aspects. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to announce the new IAU Centre for the Protection of Dark and Quiet Skies from Satellite Constellation Interference. The center is jointly hosted by SKA Observatory and NSF's NOIRLab run by AURA. Optical and infrared trails and radio transmissions by satellite constellations pose an existential threat to astronomical observations from the ground. The new center, directed by IAU past General Secretary Piero Benvenuti, with co-directors Connie at NSF's NOIRLab and Federico de Vruno at SKAO, will facilitate global coordination of efforts by the astronomical community in concert with observatories, space agencies, industry, and other sectors to help mitigate the negative consequences of satellite constellations. The united voice of the center will also raise awareness of these issues within the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the Office for Outer Space Affairs, and other international policy bodies. The center's hubs will support community efforts related to software development for observations, policies, technology, and engagement through training and outreach. The center's coordinated approach will be critical in determining and implementing solutions to help preserve our ability to study space. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Next slide, please. Vanessa, next slide. So now we are going to have an introduction to the IAU Centre from its director, Piero Benvenuti, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Padova, Italy, and IAU representative on the UN Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, known as COPUS. Go ahead, Piero.
Good morning and good evening. I'm glad to give you a short introduction to the purpose and scope of the Centre. But let me start with a few words about the role of the International Astronomical Union and the origin of the Centre. The IAU, as Debra already said, represents more than 12,000 professional astronomers from about 90 countries. And it has its main mission, the promotion and safeguard of the science of astronomy. Therefore, the IAU is very much committed in maintaining a free access to the observation of the celestial objects in all wavelength bands, in particular in optical and in radio domain. In the past, the main source of interference was the light pollution produced by the urban illumination, the so-called ALAN, artificial light at night. But more recently, the impact of the large constellations of communication satellites became a more serious concern because of their ubiquitous invasiveness. In order to mitigate their negative impact, the IAU decided to proceed along two main lines: address the issue at the level of the UN Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, seeking international consensus on mitigating measures, 2, engage and coordinate the astronomical community and all stakeholders in the development of and implementation of mitigating measures. The latter action led to the issue the call of the IAU Centre. A proposal jointly submitted by NOIRLab and SKAO was accepted by the IAU, and the relevant memorandum of understanding has just been signed yesterday. Next slide, please. The definition of the mission of the Centre stems from about 2 years of the, can I have the next slide, please? The definition of the mission of the Centre stems from about 2 years of very positive experience with a large number of colleagues and industrial partners who contributed to the organization of workshops and conferences, which will be described in the next presentations. The Centre will therefore continue and consolidate this positive collaboration. In particular, the Centre will coordinate efforts and unify voices of the global astronomical community, optical and radio. The Centre will bring together astronomers, industry, policy experts, and the wider community and act as a bridge between all stakeholders. The Centre will produce and disseminate information and resources. And finally, the Centre will continue research on satellite constellation issues to arrive at feasible and implementable solutions in the 4 areas you see in the slide, which will be described in a moment. Next slide, please. The Centre will be bilocated at NOIRLab in Tucson and in the SKAO headquarters in Manchester, but it will have a single, straightforward organization chart that is illustrated in this slide. The management team is formed by the director, myself, and the 2 co-directors, Connie Walker at NOIRLab and Federico Di Vruno at SKAO, and it will be assisted by an external advisory committee. The initial staff of the Centre is limited to about 7 full-time equivalents, but please know that the Centre is essentially a coordinating centre. The accomplishment of its task will benefit from the contribution of a large number of external collaborators, the contributing members and the affiliated members, whose role I will describe momentarily. Next slide, please. In this slide, you see the 4 main areas of activity of the centers, or hubs, as we name them. They will be described in more detail in the following presentation. In synthesis, the SAT hub will contain all information about satellites and mitigating software and strategies. The policy hub will contain information about national and international policies and their evolution. The community engagement hub disengage the community at large, making it aware of the issue. An industry and technological hub, which is an interface with industrial and technological development aiming at reducing the impact. Next slide, please. Finally, here's the plan the Centre will initially follow. The Centre will officially start its operation on April 1st, 2022. As previously mentioned, the Centre relies on the support of 2 groups of collaborators: the contributing members, who can commit quantifiable resources to the Centre hubs, and the affiliated members, who will also contribute, but without firm commitments in terms of schedule and deliverables. The proposal of the Centre received 53 letters of support from institutes all over the world, as you can see in the picture. In order to confirm and coordinate their contributions, the Centre will hold a series of listening sessions starting in mid-February and continuing until the end of March. And this activity will lead to the production of the first Centre's working plan, which will be presented to the IAU Executive Committee next April. I turn now the floor to Connie and Federico, who will give you an overview of the impact of the satellites on optical and radio astronomy. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Piero. As Piero said, we're going to have an introduction on the topic of satellite constellations from Connie Walker and Federico Di Vruno, the co-directors of the new IAU Centre. So Connie is an astronomer at NOIRLab and plays an active part in dark skies protection through leadership roles in the IAU, the International Dark Sky Association, and the American Astronomical Society. Federico is spectrum manager at the SKA Observatory. He works on the protection of the radio spectrum for scientific use. Take it away, Connie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My colleague Federico de Vruno and I are honored to represent the IAU Centre in this press briefing. Satellites are providing immense benefits to humankind. Lots of people will benefit from the global access to broadband internet service. However, it has been shown that if the numbers and the brightness of satellites cannot be minimized, they will create problems for our publicly funded large telescopes and cause the loss of science. As a result of thousands of launches planned before the end of this decade, images of satellite constellations, as in this slide, represent one of the main challenges facing the field of astronomy. Next slide, please. Astronomers became acutely aware of the challenge of satellite constellations with the launch of the first 60 Starlink satellites in May 2019. Since then, 150 experts from astronomy, industry, space policy, and the wider community conducted months of research on the impact of satellite constellations on astronomy. The issues, mitigation solutions, and pathways forward were investigated before presenting at the workshops and then publishing results. We worked together in the areas of space policy, regulations, industry guidelines, astronomical observations, software, and more. And it is upon this strong foundation that the IAU Centre is born. Next slide, please. As the number of satellites continues to grow from what is quoted on this slide, astronomy is facing a watershed moment of increasing interference with observations and loss of science. By the end of the decade, more than 5,000 satellites will be above the horizon at any given time at a typical dark sky observatory location. A few hundred to several thousand of these satellites will be illuminated by the sun. These satellites will be detectable by even the smallest optical or infrared telescopes, depending on the hour of the night and the season. Moreover, up to several hundred satellites may be visible even to the unaided eye, particularly low on the horizon and in twilight hours. All this will unfold if mitigation measures are not taken. Next slide, please. In addition to the number of satellites, risks to optical astronomy from satellites include their brightness and the fact, at the moment, there is little to no regulation in space with respect to optical astronomy. For an example of brightness, assuming a 5-year lifetime, if there are 50,000 satellites or more, as projected, 10,000 would be launched and deorbited each year. That would mean, for instance, as they are orbit raising, there'll be hundreds visible to the eye on any given night. Even on station at final altitude, the satellites can be blindingly bright to astronomical equipment, from amateur telescopes to wide field of view telescopes like the Vera Rubin Observatory. Satellite trails across images plus diffuse sky brightening will create substantial impacts to most all ground-based observations. The situation is made exponentially worse if there are satellite collisions. Such collisions lead to clouds of debris, which can increase the diffuse sky background, making it more difficult to see distant objects. This is another significant reason to avoid major collisions of satellites. The simulation you see on the right is located where we have the most observatories in Chile during a summer night. The yellow dots are visible satellites. Now, Federico will tell us about the threats to radio astronomy. Federico?
Thank you, Connie. Modern radio observatories need to observe not only in the protected ITU bands, as you see marked here in yellow, but also in much broader frequency ranges, as you see marked in blue. To do this, we have historically relied on technical mitigation, especially avoiding satellites, as well as locating radio telescopes within radio quiet zones, these remote areas protected by national legislation, but without influence on satellites. Radio telescopes can see all satellites above the horizon. Before the mega constellations, most of them were fixed in the sky in the geostationary belt, as you can see as blue dots in this simulation on the right. All the other color dots represent faster moving satellites planned by constellations, some of them in deployment already. Avoiding satellites will be a much harder task, and the challenges to access the radio spectrum will only increase, even in radio quiet zones. We are facing a situation where the combination by ITU bands coupled with local radio quiet zones are gradually becoming insufficient to address the needs of modern radio astronomy. Next slide, please. So what kind of science will be impacted the most? For radio astronomy, all science which requires observations in frequencies where megaconstellations have downlinks or close to will be affected. Like, for example, the cosmic microwave background experiments using total power detectors that could be blinded by satellite downlinks, or studies of extragalactic radio emissions redshifted into satellite bands, such as the epoch of reionization or searching for organic molecules as precursors of life. At optical wavelengths, observations with long exposure times will be affected the most, particularly in the hours close to twilight and observing low on the horizon. A prime example would be the potential hazardous asteroid research done by the International Asteroid Warning Network. Also, observations with optical telescopes that observe large portions of the sky would be affected. New generation telescopes with wide fields of view and sensitive detectors like the Vera Rubin Observatory coming online in the near future will be significantly impacted if no substantial mitigations are implemented. And here, working with Rubin Observatory is Meredith Rawls to tell us more about one of the hubs of the IAU Centre called SatHub.
Great, thank you, Federico and Connie. So now we will have an introduction to SatHub, which is a public coordinated satellite observation hub. The introduction will be given by Meredith Rawls, who works with the Vera Rubin Observatory Legacy Survey of Space and Time group at the University of Washington. Go ahead, Meredith.
Thank you so much. I'm a research scientist at the University of Washington with a background in stellar astrophysics, and that's how I first learned about the problem of satellite constellations from the context of Vera Rubin Observatory. So I'm pleased today to introduce SatHub, which is a key takeaway from the SatCon2 observation working group that I chaired this last summer. SatHub is one of the 4 main hubs of the new IAU Centre, and the idea is to be a community resource for understanding, mitigating, and disseminating everything having to do with observations of satellites. It will be open to the public. There's not going to be any paid subscriptions or proprietary restrictions, and I will briefly describe the 5 aspects of SatHub now. Next slide, please. The first is astronomical data repositories. The idea here is that we need to collect affected data products and enable studies so that we can quantify the impacts on science. As an optical astronomer, my first thought here is we need to collect big piles of images that have streaks in them, which is kind of how I first became aware of the problem and how a lot of colleagues are first becoming aware of this problem. To that end, I'm leading the Trailblazer project at University of Washington's Dirac Institute, which will be kind of the first of these efforts to have a single landing place for astronomical FITS files taken from observatories worldwide, so that we can get a representative sample of images with streaks and then serve them to anybody who wants to study the problem as it changes dynamically in real time. But this is just the start. We need to go beyond professional observatory images and have other kinds of data repositories to include radio data, observations from amateurs, and even just DSLR photography can contribute to understanding the problem. Because if we don't have data, we can't really take the next step to come up with solutions. Next, please. Another key aspect of SatHub is an orbital solution portal. So if you need information about positions or trajectories of satellites, we want this to be the first place that you go, past or future, whatever you're trying to look up. Now, there are already some resources that exist that serve data like this, but the goal is to set a precedent for sharing this orbital solution data in a standard way, such that satellite operators, whether they've been launching for a while or are just coming on the scene now, are encouraged to share their data every 8 hours or immediately following a maneuver, whichever is first, and to include error bars so that anyone who is writing software or interfacing with this can easily pull in data from different satellite operators. And we want to synchronize and coordinate with complementary services, not reinvent them. Software tools are also very important. So the SatCon2 algorithms working group described the need for several different tools. These don't exist yet. There are some examples of specific ones for certain observatories. that do exist, but they need to be broadened and developed to be more observatory agnostic. And we need to have a kind of a central landing place to share existing tools and build new ones and coordinate this effort. That includes making sure that we have user-friendly documentation so that the software we build is accessible to newcomers and to the community at large, as well as a test suite so that if somebody writes a new software tool, they have a way to see if it is working the way that they're hoping to answer the questions that they want to address. Next, please. It's all well and good if you have a big pile of data and a big pile of software, but it's really no use unless there is a training curriculum for how to actually use this. This is a very new problem for astronomy and the world. It, only a couple of years ago is when these satellite constellations have started launching and really showing up in our data products and affecting our view of the sky. So it's really important to build a training curriculum. This is why this is one of the aspects of SatHub. We have in the SatCon2 observations working group report, we've outlined a training curriculum, but we have yet to flesh it out. So now is the time to actually write and pilot this curriculum. We want it to be able to help observers of all kinds, depending whatever equipment that you have. If you are looking at the sky, you are able to take observations to contribute to the effort to better understand the problem and work towards mitigations. Okay, next, please. So to conclude, we want everyone to be able to interface with SatHub. This is not just a tool for astronomers, it's for sky observers of all kinds, data analysts, software developers, satellite industry experts, students. I want this to be the kind of resource that I wish I had when I started learning about this problem for the first time 2 years ago. It's important that SatHub include a place to facilitate observer-operator dialogues, because as more operators begin launching and existing operators change some of the details of their satellites and their launch strategies, that will change the impact on astronomy and on different kinds of science. So it's important that we're able to kind of capture this dynamic changing environment by having a constant communication between all the different parties involved. I want to emphasize that the information in SatHub is always going to be public and open. That is a kind of a tenet of how this is all going to work, and accessible to support this kind of real-time collaboration that needs to happen. We need to bring together and connect existing resources, as well as provide a place for new and innovative solutions to be built and contributed together. So I look forward to building this community resource so that we can move towards a future with dark and quiet skies. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. All right, so now we're going to have an introduction on the Policy Hub from Richard Green. Richard is Assistant Director for Government Relations and a research professor at Steward Observatory at the University of Arizona. Richard, turn on your video and sound, please.
Thanks, Amanda. Ready to go. So there is a need for this new structure of a policy hub to coordinate policy action, both in individual countries and internationally. The threat is real, as Connie described the modeling simulations. In actual fact, the number of recorded streaks is also increasing very rapidly. So the goal of these kind of policy activities is to make sure that the good intentions of industry can also be codified into achievable regulations for all space actors. For example, making a condition of licensing that we require mitigation for these adverse effects. And we're also advocating that spacefaring nations provide some resource to mitigate these adverse effects, for example, support of SatHub. Next slide, please. Challenges that we're facing at the moment are that, in general, obligations to balance the kind of priorities for space commerce and wireless broadband against the negative impacts of a rapid commercialization of low Earth orbit are not in place. They aren't structurally in place and are at best in the discussion phase in a few countries. So there isn't a coherent voice advocating for this balance that's really going to be required. And very few countries have a comprehensive regulatory framework that from launch to deorbit that includes on-orbit operations. For example, in the US, the licensing and regulation is distributed over multiple federal agencies. So we really need some cohesion between the astronomy needs for reducing reflected sunlight and the number of streaks if possible, the industry's ability to actually hit the targets that astronomers have defined to limit that brightness, and a regulatory approach that is practical, that could be achievable by industry. Next slide. So what will this policy hub do? Well, we think that this IAU Centre can really significantly contribute to overcoming these challenges and places where there is now a sort of absence of this activity. For one thing, the intention is to provide ongoing support to organizations and to policymakers so that there is good information and an available information exchange among national advocacy groups, and a kind of coordinated effort to educate policymakers on what these needs are. This policy hub definitely wants to support IAU efforts for international framework, and so UN COPUOS in particular, to endorse the kind of protections that are needed through national regulatory action. We can provide a central source of information on closely related space policy issues. And as Federico said, there are issues where the ITU negotiates issues of spectrum management quite closely, but the protection of radio quiet zones from above is new territory and requires some real coordination. Next slide. So, implementation, how will we go about this? It will be based on the recommendations of the workshops that have been held, the NSF-sponsored SATCON 1 and 2, and the UN IAU Dark and Quiet Skies 1 and 2 workshop have policy analysis in them and a technical framework. The activities in international forums will be coordinated through the IAU, SKAO, and key affiliates such as European Southern Observatory. National implementation through at individual countries and regions will rely on the coordination of affiliates like the American Astronomical Society in the US, Royal Astronomical Society in UK, European Astronomical Society, and other groups that we involve in this coordination. And we know, we are just trying to add our information. It's sort of unique to astronomy that misdirected sunlight and radio beams impact our observations, but it ties in with a whole suite of concerns about space traffic management that we want to have as an approach to sustainable balance in the use of space. Next slide, please. So progress to date. Well, the Dark and Quiet Skies workshops are getting positive attention from those at UN level, and we are hopefully on a path to influencing COPUOS itself. Advocacy by international observatories and national societies are getting attention of policymakers in space and regulatory agencies. And so as a couple of examples, in the US, the American Astronomical Society originated briefings that is generating real interest in SATCON 2 and Dark and Quiet Skies 2 results. We've talked with congressional committees, State Department, White House, FCC, and FAA. And in Europe, the European Astronomical Society has already been in contact with the European Commission and is conducting outreach to individual members of European Parliament. So as there is urgency to develop the technical mitigations that Meredith talked about, there is equal urgency to create awareness that we want a good balance in the sustainable use of space. So thanks. I'll turn it back to Amanda.
Thanks so much, Richard. So now we're going to have an introduction on the Community Engagement Hub from Jessica Heim from the University of Southern Queensland. Jessica's research interests involve exploring human relationships with both sky and land, with a particular focus on dark skies, as well as the ethics and policy issues associated with space exploration and development. Jessica, turn on your video and mic, thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Jessica Heim, a member of SatCon 2's Community Engagement Working Group, and I will be talking about the Community Engagement Hub of the IAU Centre. Today, I'm speaking to you from Minnesota on the traditional and treaty land of the Dakota people who, along with the Ojibwe, are the indigenous people of this land, Minnesota-Makoche, Dakota for the land where the water reflects the sky. Next slide, please. My background is in cultural astronomy, a field that explores the countless ways people have engaged with the night sky and the importance of this to all aspects of their science and culture. Throughout time and across the planet, people have been inspired by the starry night sky we all share. Next slide. Thus, we are all stakeholders in the future of the night sky and space. However, in the context of the emerging space economy, accompanied by the rapid increase in satellite megaconstellations, few of these stakeholders' voices have been heard. By launching tens of thousands of satellites in the coming decade, we stand to irrevocably alter the night sky, which has been a part of the human environment since time immemorial. Thus, it is essential that more diverse perspectives on the future of our shared skies are incorporated into decision-making processes. Next slide. SatCon 1 began this by engaging in dialogue between professional astronomers and satellite operators. For SatCon 2, this was expanded further, and the Community Engagement Working Group was created in order to engage a wide set of constituents in our shared goals for dark skies and a sustainable presence in space, and to lay a foundation for ongoing communication and collaboration to preserve space as a scientific, environmental, and cultural resource for humanity. Next slide. To begin to address these objectives, our working group, led by Aparna Venkatesan and James Lowenthal, engaged with a number of constituencies, such as people from various indigenous communities, as well as with amateur astronomers, astrophotographers, astrotourism professionals, and the planetarium community. We also sought to learn more about environmental and social justice issues associated with increased launches. Our goals were to bring more stakeholders to the table, listen to people's thoughts and concerns, build long-term relationships, and work to ensure that underrepresented voices are heard. In our conversations with these diverse communities, we heard many perspectives on the rapid changes happening in the night sky. Streaks in images were an issue frequently mentioned by astrophotographers, and some amateur astronomers found increased satellites to be disruptive to their observations. The potential rise in overall sky brightness from the cumulative effect of increased objects in low Earth orbit was another area of concern. Indigenous members of our working group drew attention to the long and painful history of colonization, and many voiced concerns that the rapid proliferation of satellite constellations is a new form of colonization. Next slide. It was noted that satellites literally interrupt our relationship with the stars and ceremonial ways of connecting with them, and if light pollution is erasing indigenous stories, these satellites are rewriting them. While it is true, next slide, please, that many rural and indigenous communities are in need of improved internet access, a service satellite constellations may be able to help provide, this issue is much more complex. Indigenous communities in particular have experienced a long history of outsiders coming in to help communities with pre-made solutions rather than working collaboratively to find out what the community's needs and concerns really are. Next slide, please. To truly help address issues faced by Indigenous and other communities, it is essential to develop long-term collaborative relationships rooted in respect, consideration, and consultation. Next slide. Through engaging with these diverse communities, our working group found several recurring themes. Among these were, the sky belongs to everyone, and all people are impacted by changes in the sky. The sky is a part of the environment, and Earth's ecosystems can be affected by changes in the sky. We concluded that it is essential for industry, leadership, space actors, and all constituencies to work together to co-create a shared, ethical, and sustainable approach to space. Next slide. Now, as a hub of the new IAU Centre, the Community Engagement Working Group is excited to continue our work, develop relationships, and engage with more communities. As the scope and impact of the space economy increases, it is imperative that key players in space activities consult with, listen to, and respect the perspectives of communities affected by changes in the night sky. The Community Engagement Hub will work to assist in facilitating opportunities for such meaningful, productive collaboration between diverse constituencies. We will continue the work begun with SATCON 2 and will build relationships by hosting discussion forums and workshops. In addition, we will expand our social media presence and create a website hub of resources to enable conversations and relationship building among communities. Next slide. We are excited to be a part of the IAU Centre and look forward to helping to create a truly just, equitable, and sustainable future on Earth and in space. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I'm going to leave the screen up for just a moment. Note that we are going to add a PDF copy of these slides to the press release link shortly after the end of this press conference. So everyone will have access to these email addresses. I want to thank all the presenters for doing a great job of keeping to time, and now we have some time for questions. Before we switch to that, I want to remind you that you can enter your questions into the Q&A box. Please include your affiliation and, if you can, who your question's for. And then my colleague Anim van Wyk from SKA Observatory's media team will read the questions aloud so we can get them answered and recorded for the live stream. So at this point, let me ask Vanessa to stop sharing her screen and the panelists to turn on your video. And then panelists, you can turn on your audio when you're ready to answer a question. Rob, if we're in gallery view, that would be great. And I will turn it over to Anim to get us started.
Thank you, Amanda. We'll try to get through all of the questions if possible. The first one is from Ethan Siegel, who writes the Big Think science blog. He asks, when you say the Centre will bring together representatives from industry and technology, what confidence should we have that the goals of preserving the night sky will not be compromised by the voices of those who seek to profit off its exploitation? Connie, would you like to start, and then we'll see if anybody else wants to add.
Well, hi, we've already established relationships with 3 of the biggest satellite companies and have a few more that we've been talking to as well. Industry representatives and engineers have been members of our workshop working groups and specifically have led an industry perspectives working group, A guidelines agreement with industry is in process at this moment. We have confidence we can agree on some mitigation solutions before, and they specifically request before the design of the satellites have actually started. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Let's give Piero a chance.
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Connie said about this important problem. Of course, it's difficult to predict the future. We know what it has happened so far, which is satisfactory with the companies that have been launching and designing the first constellation. I think that the example that they made about the collaboration should be followed by future companies. But remember that we are also raising this issue at the level of the UN Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And there, the influence of important nation and delegation like the US is quite important to have consensus of guidelines. And so we are confident that the future companies will also follow suit to what has been done by SpaceX and Amazon so far. The important thing, as Connie said, is that we start discussing with the companies early on when they start designing the constellation so that they can take into account the experience we gain. And the center will certainly offer help in finding solutions for them that do not compromise their goal. At the same time, they minimize the impact on the astronomical observations.
Over to you, Richard.
I think it's definitely the case that IAU's primary priority is to take this cooperative approach with industry and have them establish a voluntary corporate culture that looks to mitigate these impacts. On the other hand, the notion of having a policy approach to regulators in multiple countries is to codify these good intentions so that If the profit motive does start to intrude and make these mitigations difficult for them, we have some backup to say it really is a requirement that they look into these issues. So trying that two-pronged approach of cooperation in the first instance and regulation to enforce it if that becomes necessary.
Thank you. Our next question is from Nicole Mortiaro from CBC News. Asking, will there be a specific resource for amateur astronomers or night sky photographers to submit their images, as it was mentioned that the public can contribute? Jessica, would you like to start? You're muted, Jessica.
So I feel like that would probably be better directed to someone else on the panel.
Sure. Let's get Meredith.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so a piece of SatHub absolutely will include a resource for amateur astronomers, night sky photographers, et cetera, to contribute images. This is not set up yet. We've just announced the IAU Centre. It finally is real. So this is something that is absolutely a part of SatHub that we want to build. But I don't have a website to send you to just yet. So please do stay tuned and don't email them to me yet.
Thank you. Jeff Fist from Space News asked, what is the budget of the centre and how is it funded? Did the IAU receive any other proposals for the centre beyond the one from NOIRLab and SKAO? Piero, please give it a go.
Yes, the initial budget is not a big one. The IAU is providing some operation budget to the center, and the two institutes co-hosting the center will provide in-kind contribution with staff. This will allow the center to initiate their task, but certainly when we will have to move from the prototype software solution and mitigation that we have to a service that is provided worldwide, then certainly we will need more resources. So one of the tasks of the center will certainly start to start fundraising with companies and foundations that want to contribute to this effort. And certainly we will also consult the companies that are operating the satellite for getting from them contribution, either in kind or financial contribution. So up to now, this has never been tried because there was not a subject to do this, but now we can start this. So this will be the situation. As for the other proposal received by the IAU, I turn the question to either Jose Miguel or Debra.
Yes, we did receive one other proposal, and the advantage of the one that we accepted with NOIRLab and SKAO was that it had the endorsement of dozens of other institutions, as Piero mentioned. We fully expect that the other proposal, that those people will become part of the contributing members of the new center, because certainly the idea is that anyone who wants to play a role in this important effort becomes part of the process.
Thank you. We have a question from Ramin Skiba from Wired. How much impact do you think the policy hub could have, not just on UN COPIOS, but also on US and EU law? Is there a way to encourage policymakers to take dark skies as seriously as space debris? Perhaps we can start with Richard.
Sure, I'm happy to elaborate a little bit on that slide because I think this was a prototype for how the policy hub is intended to operate, which is that we have the information to present from the results of SATCON2 and Dark and Quiet Skies 2 workshops. In the US case, the AAS has arranged for a number of briefings, and we've already seen some interesting responses where the General Accounting Office is coming out with some recommendations, and the Federal Aviation Administration is also being very responsive. And similarly on the European side, with the same kind of information, the European Commission is starting to be responsive to that. So we are hopeful that this policy hub will allow us to coordinate on an international basis.
Would Andrew like to add something? Perhaps Aparna?
I can go after Andy if he wishes to add.
I mean, I think just to emphasize what Richard said, that it's important to note that many of the national societies already have established links with their relevant national policymakers, and I think the centre can play a key role in being a central hub for collecting information and best practices and sharing exchanges and knowledge about this interaction.
Thank you. Aparna?
Yeah, thank you very much. And Ramin, great to have you here, and also all the other writer and media friends. Thank you for being here today at such short notice. I think this is a really good question. As you can see, we are trying to bring together many different constituencies under one umbrella, which is the beginning of a long-term journey for our shared skies. Subsets of our group have dreamed about a version of the Clean Water Act, for example, a Clean Skies Act, and what that might look like from not just professional astronomy concerns, but as Jessica wonderfully highlighted, all the constituencies in our shared skies. And I want to open the floor to James here, my co-chair, in a moment. There are so many aspects to this. I think astrophotographers and amateur astronomers' role have already been mentioned for partnerships. But of course, there's Indigenous communities, planetaria, environmental and ecological aspects. And I just want to emphasize one point, which is all constituencies ranging from commerce and military to, cultural and scientific practices with the skies, even if the goals do not necessarily overlap, may even seem orthogonal, I think everybody would like to have sustainable uses and to continue to have access for the long term, not just for the next few years or decades, but for the next few centuries at least. So that is what unites us. And I'm hoping, Ramin, that with policy coming together around all of these constituencies under this new center, that can happen and become a reality. James, would you like to add to that?
Not sure I can say it any better than that, Aparna. There is obviously no silver bullet. It's a very complex problem. It's maybe not as complex as climate change, but how much success have we had internationally at solving climate change? Not much. This is a thorny problem with many different players and aspects and forces and cultures and nations and policies interacting in complex ways. And without the center, we can see how much challenge we've had at communicating with each other. It has been a productive couple of years, but the center, we hope, will really, as Aparna and others have said, help coalesce all those efforts under one roof. I'm sure that other efforts are going to be necessary at the same time to solve this difficult problem, just as no single United Nations commission, no matter how large and expertly staffed, can solve climate change. Similarly, we will continue to have participants in the conversation outside of the center, but the center still plays an essential role.
Thank you, James. We've received multiple questions from the same journalist, so I try to get one answered, and then if there's time, we'll get back to a second one, just in the interest of fairness. So we have Alan Boyle from GeekWire. He has a question for Connie. You say you've been in contact with 3 leading companies. Would those be SpaceX, OneWeb, and Telesat? Have you been in contact with Amazon Kuiper? how much influence can the project have on satellite design?
We have been in contact. We have been in contact with Amazon Kuiper, SpaceX, and OneWeb primarily, and we have like 3 other companies that have been part of our working groups. We still have a lot more to do. It's kind of hard to predict what the future holds, but each of those 3 major companies have indicated quite strongly that they would like to work with us wholeheartedly and do as much as they can. OneWeb, for instance, cannot lower their orbit altitudes to about half the height that they're at. And there's various benefits for doing that to astronomy. But there's other compromises they can make in terms of, well, not compromise, I shouldn't say it that way, out of mitigation solutions that they can do, such as lowering the brightness by coating their satellites with whatever they can. But they ask us in particular to do this before they design and launch their satellites. So we have to work very closely with them as soon as we can. And it is better to make these agreements than to really go through regulations, but because regulations take a long time to kind of solidify. But we'll, we're hopeful in talking with them already that some compromises can be made.
Richard, did you want to add to that?
Just a detail that Telesat did play an active role in developing the best practices document that came out of Dark and Quiet Skies too.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Mabel Angulo from Canal Sur TV. After 2 years with SATCOM 1 and SATCOM 2 and talks with SpaceX, the company is moving forward with its plans. What do you expect will change with the creation of this center? And then a second question, on the other hand, with SATUP, do you think that in addition to obtaining data, the community of amateur astronomers will form a pressure group in front of the mega constellations? Let's get Piero started on that, and then we can add other voices.
Yes, I think that the creation of the center will have the continuation of the work that we have done organizing the conferences where we had interaction with the companies. So I think that that will continue, it will improve just because we are becoming more visible in the game. And certainly the community engagement hub has also the purpose of making the entire community at large aware of the issue created by the constellation, and that will certainly create a more pressure, political pressure, so that we can achieve our mitigation goal. Now, obviously, we are using the support of the center, and particularly the policy hub, to present our claim to the UN COPUOS, the Committee for Peaceful Use of Outer Space, where the IAU is sitting as observer together with the ESO and SKAO and other organizations. And to give you an example, we are now presenting the result of the second conference on Dark and Quiet Skies next week, actually, to the meeting of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of COPUOS, with a working paper which has been co-signed by Chile, the delegation of Chile, Slovakia, and Spain, and is strongly supported also by the US delegation, as well as many other important countries and space active countries. So we are confident that slowly, because everything goes very slowly in the UN committees, we will have guidelines that has to be followed by all companies in the future. So that is the plan that we have, and I think we will certainly work on that in that direction.
Thank you. James, do you add something?
Yes, you asked if amateur astronomy can help provide pressure and momentum. And the answer is yes, certainly, and that is very explicitly one of the goals of our community engagement efforts. But I want to add that probably larger may well be the impact from working with environmental organizations. We saw very strongly in the community engagement working group, as Jessica beautifully summarized, that there's a practically universal perspective that the sky is part of the environment and should be considered part of the environment and should be protected under either existing or yet to be made environmental regulations. And as we all know, most people care about the environment. Environmental organizations are much larger, much more numerous, much more politically savvy and active than astronomers tend to be. And we are actively working to build ties and to share information between our communities and to build these relationships that we think will be mutually beneficial between astronomers and large international environmental organizations.
Thank you, James. We're going to try and squeeze in 2 last questions, but if we didn't get to yours, do follow up after the conference. Another question from Jeff first from Space News. What role will industry, particularly satellite constellation developers, have in the center, such as participation in the various hubs? Andy, take it away.
So I'm sure that one of the key roles that the industry hub will take in the center is to really strengthen this outreach and engagement to companies. So we can reach out directly to companies, we can reach out to industry associations, and I think part of the work will involve finding ways to collaborate and understanding each other. And of course, each company is slightly different and has its own different context and business cases. And this is something that we as an astronomy community need to work to understand. We can also reach out to various standards associations, and in the long run, make this link to national policy. Now, as part of the Dark and Quiet Skies and the SATCON work, we've had several good interactions with companies. We've collaboratively worked to produce a set of best practice guidelines, and this represents a list of several concrete actions that we can work together on. Some examples, finding ways to share data in the formats and the standards, looking at various practices for orientating satellites during orbit raising and deorbiting, and then finding ways to reduce brightness. So we need, several companies are working on these measures, and we need to form specific collaborations around these projects. Also look for funding, look for support from the industry where possible, and form a plan of action. But of course, we have to recognize that we're at the starting point of all this.
Thank you. Ethan Siegel had another question. Apologies. He writes, starts with a bang on Big Thing. I didn't know that. As Connie Walker presented in her opening statement, there are hundreds of thousands of satellites proposed in FCC and ITU filings. Is there an initiative taking place to reduce the total number of satellites and to eliminate redundant plans in order to minimize the total impact on the night sky and Earth's environment? Federico will start with this one.
Apologies, Annie. I think Piero raised his hand first, so it's okay? All right. Okay,
yeah,
Piero.
I think you should go. His throat is dry.
Okay, thank you, Piero. Yeah, so that's a great question, to be honest. And as we all said, right, this situation is only getting larger, as you say. And if you see all these ITU filings and FCC filings, there are very, very, very extremely large plans. But the reality is that, well, first of all, there is this situation of the use of space, that everyone is also can use space. So we cannot oppose to that. But at the same time, what we are trying to do is to raise the awareness of what is the situation of this increasing numbers, this continuous increasing numbers. And this is what we have been doing from the astronomical point of view, right? Which is only one of them. There are many others, like for example, the debris issue, which we don't participate so much, but we are still trying to get that into the awareness. So I think that's the way we are trying to address the continuous increase in numbers, as you say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Amanda, and we'll get back to the questions directly offline.
Thanks so much, Anim. Thank you, everyone, for attending, not only our speakers and our panelists who played a role in organising and preparing for this briefing. So we'll archive the streams the stream both on the NOIRLab and IAU YouTube channels shortly after this briefing. So I want to thank the International Astronomical Union, the SKA Observatory and NSF's NOIRLab, as well as all the other organizations that have pledged to provide support to the Centre, and they are listed in the press release. Thanks everyone for your time today. See you later. Goodbye.